we go. Okay, so got a few different faces from last week. So hopefully if you were not able to join the class last week, you at least got to listen to class. If not, I would suggest after tonight's class going back and listening to lesson 1, because all of that information is extremely important to tonight's discussion and the rest of class, right? We talked last time about history of the Roman Empire, all through the 1st century, and we even spilled over into 2nd, 3rd century and further. We talked about, we focused really on Christian persecution, right? The rise of Christian persecution and how that changed over the course of the 1st century, and what that looked like relative to the book of Revelation. So obviously that's going to be important. And then these next few discussions, because I told you last week, what we'd really be focusing on in the first half of this class is really 2 different arguments, right? When was the book of Revelation written, being either the 60s or the 90s? And then what's the scope of Revelation as far as what it's talking about? Are we talking about the Roman Empire and its fall, or are we talking about the destruction of Jerusalem? So those are the 2 things we're going to talk about over the next 4 weeks. We're going to start with the date. So we're going to talk tonight about the case for the late date, and then next week we'll talk about the evidence for the early date, and then we'll do the same thing with Rome and then with Jerusalem for our 4 weeks. So there's going to be some spillover between all 4 of these conversations that over these next 4 lessons. I would say these next 4 lessons are really one giant lesson. It's really hard to separate all of them from one another because so much of the evidence overlaps. But I've done my best to try to separate it out in a way to help it make the most sense. So tonight we're going to focus primarily on the evidence for the late date. Because as you know, I believe the book of Revelation was written in the 90s. I think the evidence supports this. And there's obviously some implications of that we'll talk about towards the end of this class. But we're going to talk about that evidence, right? Both the external evidence, right? Writings that exist outside of the Bible that help us to see the date of the book, and as well as the internal evidence, right? Looking in the book at the themes of the book to see how it supports the late date as well. Because this is a significant debate, right? The date of authorship, it impacts how we interpret the symbols of this book. It impacts the focus of the book and the scope. If Revelation was written at the early date, it would make some other suggestions about what it could be talking about. And so we can eliminate a lot of those issues out front by talking about the late date first. I believe that the overwhelming historical, textual, and theological evidence supports the late date. So that's really what we're going to talk about as we talk about the external evidence. Right? Things that are outside of the Bible that support that which is written in the Bible. Right, so if we look back to early Christian writers, right, these are people who are writing about spiritual things from the 2nd century and beyond, so right after the book of Revelation is written. We see these writings consistently place Revelation at the time of Domitian's reign, which, again, from last week, Domitian reigned from 81 to 96, but the prevailing teaching is that the book of Revelation was written around 94 to 96, sometime around that time frame, and that these 7 churches who it was written to received it probably somewhere in the later span of that, right? Somewhere close to the year 96, although we don't really have testimony of exactly when they received it. That's generally when we believe that it was written. And here's a few of those evidence as to why we believe that. One of the most prominent and most well spoken about was written by a man named Irenaeus. He wrote in the year 180, he said, "For if it were necessary that his name should be distinctly revealed in the present time, it would have been announced by him, John, who beheld the apocalyptic vision. For that vision, was seen not very long time since, but almost in our day, towards the end of Domitian's reign." And again, Irenaeus wrote that in 180 AD, so about 85 years after the book of Revelation was written. Irenaeus, from his writings, right, we know that he was he had a mentor named Polycarp, as somebody who he writes about a lot. Polycarp, through his writings and some other writings, we know was one of the members at the Church of Smyrna, very likely at the time that the book of Revelation was written. Polycarp was probably at that church when it was received. and is someone who Irenaeus says that he learned from Polycarp. And Polycarp himself was a disciple of the Apostle John, somebody who worked very closely with John, who wrote the book. So Irenaeus would have had very first-hand experience with people who were close to the writing of this book through Polycarp and the Church of Smyrna. And this is one of the most clear examples of an external reference, right? Somebody writing about the book of Revelation and very clearly putting it at the end of Domitian's reign. We're going to go through a couple of different evidences here as well. Clement of Alexandria is quoted by Eusebius in Ecclesiastical History. He wrote in the late 2nd century, "For the Apostle John, who lived in Asia after he was exiled to the island of Patmos, wrote the Apocalypse, and afterwards returned to Ephesus, where he remained until his death." So right off the bat, this is just a confirmation of the fact that John, we know he wrote from the island of Patmos, talking about the Apocalypse, and that he did return from Patmos after Domitian died. We'll see that this writing writes a little bit more about that later. But after Domitian died, John was able to leave Patmos. So we know John was only on Patmos for a short amount of time. And there's a few other writings about that. Let's look at a few of those. Eusebius in the early 4th century wrote that it is said that in this persecution under Domitian, the apostle and evangelist John, who was still alive, was condemned to dwell on the island of Patmos in consequence of his testimony to the divine world. So Eusebius is indicating to us that John was sent to Patmos under the reign of Domitian. But here's another one to back up that same idea. When John said these things, written by Victorinus, late 3rd century, when John said these things, he was in the island of Patmos, condemned to the mines by Caesar Domitian. There, therefore, he saw the apocalypse, and when grown old, he thought that he should at length receive his discharge by suffering, but Domitian being killed, he was released. Again, confirming that same idea, that John went to Patmos under the reign of Domitian, and then it was upon Domitian's death that John was allowed to go back and leave Patmos. Jerome, another writer in the 4th century, says he also wrote the Apocalypse, talking about John. He wrote the Apocalypse, which was seen by him while he was on the island of Patmos. And he wrote also one epistle. He was seen in the island of Patmos, condemned to the mines by the Emperor Domitian, and he wrote the Apocalypse. Again, Jerome wrote that. So here's just a couple examples, right? And this is not at all an exhaustive list, right? But just a few of the ideas that you can see throughout history of people confirming this date and confirming that John wrote this at the time of Domitian. Now, I think it's only fair to mention that there are people who would disagree with this stance and who would be teaching an early date or something different. Who try to undermine the writings of many of these people, as well as others that we can see, by talking about them being too far removed from Revelation, right? That because they're so far removed from the writing of Revelation, we really can't trust them. And we really can't trust that they accurately identified the date. Let's be clear up front. As we talk about external evidences, these writers were not inspired. Okay, very clear about that. Their writings are not a part of the Bible because they were not inspired by God. Therefore, their words are not infallible as an inspired writer would be. But that doesn't mean that we can just ignore them and write them off, right? It's the same way on a Sunday morning we show up and listen to Ben. We don't write him off just because he's not inspired, right? We can trust the things he says. We can verify the things he says with Scripture. And the truth of the matter is, as we look at external evidence, people want to discredit these writers as well as others who write on this subject. But the case that I'm making here, by showing a few of these external evidences that mention the book of Revelation being written at the late date, is not because we seem to have more people saying the late date than we do the early date. But in fact, as you look at early Christian writing, we have exclusively mentions of the late date. There are no early Christian writers who would agree with a date being under the time of Nero. There are no church writers claiming the book was written before AD 70, which is interesting because I don't think that's a coincidence, right? That is unified witness from multiple sources stating that the early date or stating that the late date is correct and none of them that the early date would be true. If the early date were true, it would be strange that no one spoke up, right? We have many writings stating that the book of Revelation was written under the time of Domitian, and no one spoke up to correct the record. And yet, some ask us to believe that everyone got it wrong. All of the writers got the date wrong, and all of them were incorrect that the book was written after AD 70. I would not buy into that. I think that's a silly notion to ask of us to believe that all of these people got it wrong, and that we can ignore the fact that no one wrote otherwise. In fact, we don't have any references to a pre-AD 70 date. The first time in history that we can find any writer who would date the book of Revelation pre-AD 70 was somebody named Epiphanius of Salamis. I don't know how to pronounce that name, sorry. Who lived around 310 to 403, so a couple hundred years later. But he actually dated the book in the 40s. That's the earliest reference to a pre-AD 70 date is actually a date putting it in the 40s, which no credited scholar would agree with, right? Epiphanius is an extreme outlier. He's on his own in that belief that the book was written that early. And in fact, now, scan forward through history, you really don't see common writings about an early date of Revelation until around the 1600s. So it's like 1600 years before people really started pushing and promoting and finding evidence for an early date. And at that point in history, right, if somebody wants to make the claim that these men like Irenaeus and these others were too far removed from Revelation, I would have to make that argument in regards to anyone 1600 years later disagreeing with the documented history that had existed up to that point. So if we're looking at merely external evidence, the case is entirely going in favor of a late date. There is no external evidence in this kind of writing to point to an early date. Just want to put some of this into perspective a little bit, just kind of make this grounded and a little bit more real, right? Again, focusing on the idea that people want to discredit Irenaeus, right? He wrote 85 years after Revelation was written, and he got the date wrong, right? Again, that's the claim. 85 years sounds like a long time until you put it into perspective, right? Which is why I want to put it into perspective. Can anybody think of a significant event in our history that happened 85 years ago as of today? What was happening in the world 85 years ago? There's this little event called World War II. Exactly 85 years ago was World War II. Imagine this. Imagine somebody today writing a book about World War II and getting the date wrong by 30 years, right? Not just a couple events within the war they got wrong, a couple details. They got the date of the war wrong by 30 years, right? That's what we're talking about here, is somebody that close to this kind of event getting the date wrong. I think it's extremely reasonable to say anybody could write today about World War II, and we can have a significant amount of confidence about when the war happened, right? And I would apply the same logic to Irenaeus. He personally knew Polycarp, who, as I said earlier, was a documented member at the Church of Smyrna in the 90s. Polycarp was probably there the Sunday morning when they first read this letter from the pulpit. Right, being a little facetious there. I don't know what they did with the letter when they got it, right? He was probably there when this happened, and Irenaeus would have spoken to him personally. Polycarp knew the Apostle John and likely talked at length with John about these events. I mean, just imagine, right, if you were a member at Smyrna or Ephesus or Laodicea or one of these other places, right? Think about West Main in the year 2025. Clearly this isn't going to happen. But imagine if we as a congregation got what was going to become a new book of the Bible, like the final book of the Bible. Do you think that'd be a pretty significant event for us? Do you think we would hold that close to us? Do you think you'd remember roughly when we got it? At least within 30 years? I think it would have been a pretty big event for the people of these congregations, and probably for surrounding Christians as well. News would have spread. The Apostle John saw a vision from God about the circumstances we're going through, right? Whether the book was in the 60s or whether the book was in the 90s, this would have been a big deal to Christians. Everyone would be talking about it. If you were at one of those churches when you received it, you'd tell your kids about it. You'd tell your family about it, wouldn't you? Especially if everybody's going through the same struggle, you would talk to people about it. And if you were at those congregations and you told your kids about it, your kids would be Irenaeus' age, right? Put that back into perspective. Irenaeus is not far removed from this. I think we can have a pretty high degree of confidence in men like Irenaeus and others to at least get the date right, if nothing else. And again, compounding that on the fact that nobody corrected them, there's no other writings indicating otherwise. Again, the external evidence tells us the book of Revelation was written in the 90s, under the reign of Domitian. To say otherwise is to claim that Irenaeus misunderstood and he misremembered conversations that he had with men like Polycarp or the Apostle John. Every other Christian got it wrong. No one knew otherwise, and no one corrected them. I think that's a stretch. I think it makes far more sense, according to the evidence, to date the book in the 90s, according to external evidence. Yes, question.
To put it in perspective of my life, my dad fought in World War II. Yeah. And obviously I spoke to him about events that took place there. So it's quite possible, and quite your example is very appropriate.
Yeah, I think that's true of a lot of us. You know, I have family members who much older, some who I met, some who did not, who fought in World War II. Right. So again, it's just 85 years is not that much. 85 years becomes a long time when you're trying to discredit someone. I just don't give a lot of credence to discrediting any of these men on that basis. Let's talk about internal evidence, right? So now this is going to be a much bigger conversation, and obviously this conversation will spill over the next couple of weeks, right? As we look at the details in the book, right? And obviously the details in the book have to relate to the external evidence as well. All the history we talked about last week, as well as the things we've already looked at tonight, it all has to line up. So as we're looking at these details, there's a couple of things that I want to focus on internally within the book of Revelation that point us to the late date. And first off would be the intended audience. Revelation is explicitly addressed to 7 churches in Asia Minor, right? This was one of our keys from our first Revelation class, the audience, right? These 7 churches is who John addresses this book to. So as we look at and examine the audience, it will tell us some things that I think are important. Right, as we focus first on the spiritual condition of the churches, right, there's a few different ways you can look at it. For example, right, if you look specifically at the church of Ephesus, right, we can compare their spiritual condition in the book of Ephesians, because we have another letter to that church, unlike many of the others, as well as the address that Jesus makes to this church in Revelation. And if you compare those, right, you look in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 15, you see Paul writing and commending the Ephesians for the love that they have, right, that they were great in love. And now as you skip to Revelation chapter 2, one of the condemnations of this group of people is that they have left the love that they once had, right, indicating that some time has passed. They've abandoned that love that they were commended for in the book of Ephesians. And the book of Ephesians, if we look at similar paths for that book, it's believed that book was written in the 60s. So in the 60s, the book of Ephesians says that the church of Ephesus had love. Now they don't. Some time has passed. Again, this doesn't tell us exactly when the book of Revelation was written, but it indicates to us that probably more time has passed than would be allowed if the book of Revelation was written pre-AD 70. Not definitive, but at least evidence to point to it. Another example, this one now comparing internal evidence to external evidence. If you look at the church in Laodicea, Laodicea was destroyed by an earthquake in the 60s, or in AD 60 actually. The earthquake destroyed much of the town. The town was very weak. And if you look at the book of Revelation, that's not what you see, right? You see a rich and self-sufficient Laodicea. In fact, that's what they are called out for by Jesus. Historical records would tell us Laodicea was not rich and self-sufficient in the 60s. In fact, opposite of it. The town itself is really what the history would talk to us about. But I think that's what Jesus is referencing when he talks to this church. Historical record indicates that it really was not until late 70s to mid 80s, sometime in that time frame, that Laodicea would be seen as a prosperous city again to regain what I would say would be that status of rich and self-sufficient that is talked about in chapter 3 and verse 17. Right? So a pre-AD 70 date does not allow for Laodicea to fit the historical context. This is a problem, right? Not only looking at the condition of the churches, right, we have to consider their location, right? All 7 churches that this book are addressed to are in Asia Minor. And again, if you remember back to last week, we talked about Nero's persecution of Christians. Nero's persecution of Christians, I'll remind you, did not extend outside of Rome in any significant way. We don't have documentation telling us about Nero persecuting Christians in Asia Minor. That type of evidence is just not existent. So as we look at churches like Ephesus, Smyrna, Laodicea, that are in Asia Minor, they would not have been suffering at the hands of Nero. It doesn't mean persecution wouldn't have existed at that time, right? Persecution existed for Christians in many different ways outside of the Roman Empire. But simply, a Roman Empire focus in the way that the book is speaking about wouldn't have existed in Asia Minor at this time. So as you read accounts like Smyrna and Philadelphia, for example, Smyrna being in Revelation chapter 2, verse 8 through 11, and then Philadelphia chapter 3, verse 7 through 13, right? They are warned of coming persecution and continued persecution. They are admonished for standing true in the face of the current persecution, right? But these regions were not affected until Domitian came into play at the date that we're discussing. So for Smyrna and Philadelphia, as well as all the others, to fit the historical context, you have to look to the 90s, or close to the 90s, to see this type of situation occurring in this place at the hands of Domitian. It did not exist under Nero in this part of the world. So, focusing in on that idea, right, the degree of persecution. Like we said, the location of the persecution is a problem, but also the degree of persecution, right, helps indicate to us what's going on here along this exact same line. Revelation speaks of intense, ongoing persecution that affects everyone. Under Nero, persecution was brutal, for sure, but it was limited to Rome, and it was mostly targeted at Christians as a result of the fire. Remember, Nero was trying to pass blame onto someone else for the fire, and Christians were that target. We don't have documentation of Nero persecuting Christians for any theological reasons, right? What I mean by that is he's not persecuting Christians because of what they believe or because of their belief in God, but rather to shift blame. Under Domitian, persecution was empire-wide, punished specifically for not believing Domitian was a god, executed, banished to islands, just like John was. We see those types of things. So as we compare, we did last week, we compared the persecution of Christians under Nero with Domitian. Now, compare that to the book of Revelation, right? Let's go through what the book describes about the degree of persecution and how that compares, right? In Revelation chapter 1, all tribes of the earth are addressed. In Revelation 7, every nation from all tribes, peoples, and languages. Chapter 11, the people and tribes and languages and nations, those who dwell on the earth will rejoice at the suffering of Christians. Chapter 13, over every tribe, people, language, and nation, and all who dwell on the earth will worship. Chapter 14, those who dwell on the earth, to every nation, tribe, language, and people. Chapter 16, to the kings of the whole world. Chapter 17, people, multitudes, and nations, and languages. Chapter 18, all nations, kings of earth, merchants of earth. Later in chapter 18, all nations were deceived. Do you see a common theme there? Frequently throughout the book of Revelation, we are reminded that this message is relevant to all nations, all people, all tribes. Whatever is happening at this time is happening to the whole world. We are talking about a problem on a grand scale, not just Rome. Again, putting those two things together, right? We have an audience in Asia Minor regarding a problem affected by the whole world. Which emperor fits this picture? It has to be Domitian. Nero does not fit this view. If we were discussing the problem that Christians were facing at the hands of the Roman Empire under the days of Nero, I think the audience would be different. We'd probably be talking to the Roman church, because that's who was affected. We would not be giving a message. The book of Revelation would not be talking about scenes and visions and things relevant to all tribes of the earth. As you read through the book, again, I would continuously read through the book of Revelation cover to cover as you try to make sense of a lot of this stuff and fit it into its context. The book of Revelation is very clear about who God is coming to help, and it is all Christians on the whole earth. So we have to be talking about events that affect the whole earth. The degree of persecution clearly would align with the history at the end of the first century, not at the time of Nero. So we continue in the book of Revelation, right? Let's get a little bit more specific now. I told you last week, and if you remember the picture in the background of my slides here, right? That is the beast from the sea that's seen in chapter 13. We're going to talk about the beast now. I told you last week, right? Spend some time reading chapter 13 with the history in mind to see which of the emperors and which historical moment best fit that scope. And so now I want to do that with you as we talk about the sea beast in Revelation 13, chapter 1 through 10. If you think back to the Revelation class from last year, just to put this back in its context in case you've forgotten, in chapter 13, we have just finished talking about the first enemy of God's people in chapter 12. Does anybody on this call remember who that was? Chapter 12. It was the dragon, okay? In chapter 12, we talked about the dragon, which we know to be Satan, right? Read chapter 12. Go back and listen to the class if you don't remember. It's very clear in that chapter we're talking about Satan. And now chapter 13 tells us that here are two henchmen, are the words that I used in that class, for Satan, right? Two individuals working on behalf of Satan. The first of those being the beast from the sea. And within the context of Revelation, we said that the sea beast was the political power of Rome, right? The political headship that is really embodied by the emperor. So if we're in the 60s, that would be Nero. If we're in the 90s, it's Domitian. And so that's who we're looking at here in this context. So let's talk about the details that chapter 13 gives us about this beast, and again, put them into their context. Verse 1 tells us that this beast wears blasphemous names on his head. Right? The idea of blasphemous names, it's different than later when we'll talk about it in a little bit, where he blasphemes God with the things he says. Blasphemous names would tell us that his identity is blasphemy to God. Right? Who this beast is, or at least claims to be, would be blasphemy to God. And I think this would align with Domitian, openly demanding to be called a god. Nero accepted the title, right? So Nero could be shoehorned into that if you tried hard enough. Nero accepted honors as a god, but he did not identify himself as God. Right? Domitian accepted and enforced the title Lord and God over all. Domitian in his identity was blasphemous against God, and that would align with this beast. In verse 3, I will mention this because many people do on this subject. This idea about one head wounded and healed and the world being amazed. A lot of the sources that I read connect this to the Nero Redivivus myth, and I'll explain that in a second. I personally don't know if I would go that far to put it on this. What the Nero Redivivus myth is at this time, people were very familiar in the 90s with Nero. Obviously, everybody knew who he was, knew the kinds of things he did, the kinds of things he stood for. Everybody was familiar with his very targeted attack on Christians in the city of Rome. And so Domitian, taking a similar attack on Christians on a much grander scale, a lot of people called him Nero 2.0 or Nero Redivivus, right? The reincarnation of Nero it's a myth that some people placed on him. I don't know if people believed it literally, right? A reincarnation, but at least that's the idea that people would put forward. And some believe that verse 3 is talking about that idea, one head wounded and healed, right? Nero being the wounded head and Domitian being the healed version of that head to come back. It could be. So I give that to you because it could be evidence towards that. I personally think one head wounded and healed is simply talking about the ongoing power of the Roman Empire, right? One head gets wounded, another one would take its place, right? That the headship would continue. But that world amazed part, right, would line up now with this context, right? That now as the head is healed, as the power is shifted to Domitian, the entire world is amazed by him, right? So I still think there is some evidence there towards the late date, but not necessarily in the way that a lot of people would. But again, I give that to you. You can make of that idea what you will, because you will read about that a lot in these discussions. Verse 4, people worship the dragon and the beast, right? Emperor worship as allegiance to Satan's system, right? This beast was given his authority by the dragon, by Satan, right? Domitian institutionalized emperor worship empire-wide, especially in Asia Minor. We have documentation of that. Nero did not require worship. He accepted it at times when people were willingly offering it. He didn't require it. He didn't expect it. It wasn't happening to the degree that it was with Domitian. Domitian expected this to be happening on a grand scale. This beast expecting worship would align more with Domitian. Verse 5, his mouth speaks blasphemies, right? Clearly Domitian is openly speaking against God and against the beliefs of Christians, right? His idea that he is Lord and God, he is openly speaking against that. Again, Nero was not openly speaking against the beliefs of Christians. He had a purpose in what he was doing. There was a different motive in his persecution. Again, persecution was still bad, but it was a different motive, and it was not in blasphemy towards God, although it would have been, God would not have been happy, obviously, but it is a very different type of hostility towards God that Domitian displayed, and I think that aligns better with this beast. In verse 6, that same idea, right? Blaspheming God in heaven. Verse 7, making war on the saints and conquering them over every tribe and people and language and nation, right? This is one of those references we talked about earlier that tells us the scope of the persecution that this beast is displaying, that it is over every tribe, people, and language and nation. That very clearly has to be Domitian, because Nero was not doing that. Nero was persecuting in Rome, not Asia Minor. And then in verse 8, the earth dwellers worship him. Again, this idea that everyone on the earth was worshiping this beast. Not that Christians were, but again, that idea of widespread allegiance and pressure by the empire, right? So the details in this book, right? Are there a few details that we could say would also apply to Nero? Yes, that is true. Right? Many people with an early date view want to point that out, that some of these things could also apply to Nero. Let's be honest, that's true. But which of the two emperors can encompass every detail of this chapter? It would have to be Domitian, right? There are some significant issues in placing Nero in this chapter, and it just doesn't work because it does not fit the scope of what Nero did as emperor of the Roman Empire. So the sea beast, right, very clearly fits Domitian. And there's more evidence for it we'll talk about in just a second, right? Because as we shift to the second beast that's discussed in this chapter, in chapter 13, verse 11 through 18, we have the earth beast. Again, let's remember back to our Revelation class. The earth beast, we know from his actions and how he's described, that we said that this was the emperor cult that enforced the emperor worship of Domitian. And I think that's clear as we look at the details of this beast in verse 11 and on. This beast rises from the earth, lamb-like with a dragon's voice, right? That idea of this false prophet, religious ideas and the enforcement of worship was its goal, what it was doing. And this was true of the cult during the days of Domitian. He exercises the authority of the first beast and promotes worship, right? That's in verse 12. Under Domitian was using the cult, the emperor cult, the Koinon and other groups, to do this work, to promote the enforcement of worshiping him. Nero did not do that. We don't have record of Nero using the empire's cult to do his bidding outside of the city of Rome. Now, he definitely had reach outside of Rome, right? But not in the way that this chapter is describing, this cult, this enforcement of especially emperor worship. Nero was not doing that. Verse 13, he performs great signs and calls from fire, right? The false religious wonders. Again, I don't believe Nero's motives were religious. I don't believe he was doing these types of things and trying to deceive people on that level. Maybe deceiving in some other ways, for sure. But not to the same motive. Verse 14, he deceives people and tells them to make an image of the first beast. This fits perfectly the description of how Domitian used the empire's resources, building images of himself and sending those out to force worship. It's very hard to read this chapter and not see signs of the acts Domitian was committing all throughout the world, especially in places like Asia Minor, and to see the lack of evidence, right, for Nero. It's very hard for me to go through this chapter and not see glaring signs of Domitian. Verse 16, causes all to receive a mark, and that pairs with verse 17, that no one can buy or sell without that mark, right? This was one of the punishments that Domitian employed through Asia Minor and other places, right? Worship Domitian or there are consequences, right? Again, this is something that took place in the entire world. And then that mark is 666. There's some things around 666 in regards to this topic, but we're going to save that for next week because I think it's more relevant to that discussion. But again, so as we look at these two beasts, right, with an accurate view of history, you have a very hard time fitting Nero into this view. So as I talk about this being a case for the late date, it's also a case against the early date, right? This is where that realization that I brought up last week, my kind of jokey realization that I mentioned last week about the entire book of Revelation being written at the same time. If you're going to place the date of the book in the 60s, you have to find a way to harmonize every single one of these details with that book. We cannot pick and choose the details that seem to fit our view. We must see which encompasses all of it. And I think it's very clear from the historical point of view that Domitian is the only emperor, and his use of the resources through the earth beast is the only thing that fits the interpretation of chapter 13. It cannot be looking towards Nero and also align with history. So I want to talk for a minute about implications of a late date. We're not done talking about evidences. Like I said, I'm splitting the evidences up into the 4 different discussions and how they best fit. But the evidences that we've looked at so far, I think, are some of the strongest that point to the late date being the theme of the book. That which the book talks about aligns more closely with the late date view. As we talk about implications of a late date, right? What is that going to force us to conclude if we take a late date view? And I think first and foremost, right, Revelation cannot be about Jerusalem. We're going to have a whole class about this, right? About evidence for and against Jerusalem, as well as the focus on Rome. But right up front, right, if we're willing to admit and to see that the evidence points us to a late date, we immediately cannot be talking about Jerusalem, right? The destruction of Jerusalem was in AD 70. So if we're after it, there's no point in talking about it anymore, right? So we eliminate much of the discussion on alternate views of this class when we date the book the way that we do. This undermines a lot of the preterist views, right, that we're going to talk about in the second half of this class when Stephen takes over and the elders take over. This idea of Jerusalem and that which comes from the view towards AD 70 and the destruction of Jerusalem, all of that becomes eliminated, right? If we can stop here and place the date here, the second half of this class doesn't need to happen, right? It kind of goes away. We're still going to have the rest of this class, don't worry. Stephen prepared some good conversations. But it doesn't have to happen, right? The late date eliminates that being a possibility. And it forces us to conclude that Revelation is a warning against empires like Rome, right? Rome is now the only thing left that could fit the view. And there's no other scholar stating otherwise, to my knowledge. This book is primarily either Jerusalem or Rome. This eliminates the Jerusalem argument and forces us to conclude that the book is talking about Rome. And that's going to be very important next week and the following week because we'll shift away from the beasts and we'll start looking at the harlot in chapters 17 and 18, because that's really where the bulk of the discussion will happen on the Rome versus Jerusalem argument. Again, if we have a late date, then we cannot be looking to Jerusalem when we get to those later conversations. And again, the entire book was written at the same time. So if chapter 13 helps us see the date, that's going to help us see the date in other places as well. And also the late date. Again, this is to summarize this whole class tonight. The late date allows the book to align accurately with the history of the first century. I believe that every detail of this book, the ones we've talked about tonight and many that we haven't talked about yet, align with the history we talked about last week, right? That's why the history class last week was so important, because it very clearly, this book is describing those events. So again, we're going to wrap up tonight's class right here. Just to kind of summarize, right? We talked about the audience and some of the details about the audience and how that confirms for us the date because they fit the historical context of the 90s. And we talked about the beasts, right? The two beasts in those details and how those fit, as well as the external evidence and the overwhelming support of the external evidence for the late date. So this discussion is not done, right? We're going to come in to the next class, and what we're going to do is, like I said last week, when I started doing my research on this, I wanted to know, was the late date really correct like I had thought for so many years, or was there stronger evidence for the early date? And so what I want to do next week is do my best to propose what I believe is the strongest evidence for the early date. And then I'm also going to share with you why I didn't personally find it convincing and why I personally see flaws in those views that would prevent me from placing the book any earlier than the 90s. So that'll wrap tonight's lesson. Thanks for joining. If you have any comments or questions, go for it now. We can talk about anything that you want on the subject.